Malolactic fermentation refers to a bacterial fermentation that results in the conversion of harsh-tasting malic acids into more supple-tasting lactic acids. ML, as malolactic fermentation is often referred to in a winery, also renders the wine more microbacteriologically stable. This is true for both red and white wines, but in this video I'm discussing the process primarily as it is associated with red wines. With red grapes, a 3 to 4 week yeast fermentation is followed by a 3 to 4 month bacterial fermentation, that's ML, at room temperature. If the wine is kept up to temperature in the northern hemisphere, the ML should be complete by February 1st or so. At the beginning of primary yeast fermentation, 40 to 50 ppm of SO2 is added to the grapes. 3 weeks later, when the ferment is complete, very little free SO2 is left in the must, perhaps only 5 ppm. The sulfur compounds have been metabolized by the yeast. That's good because then the wine will go through ML, a bacterial fermentation, and bacteria are very sensitive to sulfur compounds, plural. Now I must add that this entire process from the yeast ferment through ML is a natural process that the wine will go through anyway. We are merely encouraging and managing it. So when we start out, when we start out ML, I want the yeast to ferment the must all the way down to minus 1.5 down to minus 2 Brix, or 0.997 down to 0.996 specific gravity, depending on how you measure. At that time, the juice should be down to only about 5 ppm free SO2, like I mentioned. Then we will siphon or pump and press and screen the juice out of the fermenters into a settling tank, allow the juice to settle for 1 day, and then rack off the slightly clarified juice off of the gross lees, that's what it's called, leaving the gross lees on the bottom of the settling tank, and I will siphon off into, say, a barrel. I will not fill the barrel. First, I will bring it up to temperature. Now there's still sediment in the fine lees. In the lees, there's still sediment in the wine. Now we can call this wine, by the way. Before it was juice, and now it's wine. There's still sediment in the wine that we call fine lees. We want that for the nutrients, but we don't stir it up like one does when one makes white wine. Now I noticed that some of the home wine makers have gotten that confused. In a white wine making process, we're using a low temperature white wine yeast, say 52 to 59 degrees Fahrenheit, which is like 11 to 15 degrees centigrade. And we're fermenting a white wine all winter long on the yeast, putzing along. During that process, we will perform botonnage and we will stir up the yeast on the bottom of the white wine. Red wine malolactic bacterial fermentation, I do not stir it up. Now, the wine is brought up to temperature. So it depends, the temperature depends on the culture that one is using, and I'll get to that in a minute. Now, in the olden days, should I inoculate or should I not inoculate? Well, if a barrel like was used previously for ML, the standard winery wisdom is that you don't have to inoculate. The bacteria is already in the barrel. But you can also inoculate with a culture, or you can choose not to inoculate. Now there's a growing trend in California right now. There's winemakers that do natural ML. I haven't tried it yet. I may not. I don't know. But this is Pinot Noir in these 2 barrels. And so I used a Lalvin product, Lalvin MBR31, which is appropriate for Pinot Noir. It has an alcohol tolerance only up to 14%. It's a lower temperature culture. So in other words, 68 to 72 degrees Fahrenheit, 20 to 2 degrees Celsius for that culture, which is nice. I would not use MBR31 if I was making Syrah out of Washington State grape because it tends to be so ripe, the alcohol levels are high. And then I would use the Christian Hansen CH16 or VPR41, another Lalvin product, or one of the other ML cultures that are high alcohol tolerance. Home winemakers, once again, go on the website, check it out, make sure that your product is going to work for the wine that you're making. I will reiterate, I would not use MBR31 for high alcohol wine. But I would definitely use MBR31 for Pinot Noir because this is barely 12%. What's in these barrels here? Now, so what bacteria are we talking about? We're talking about a bacteria that's called Enococcus enos. It used to be called, formerly it was called Leuconostoc enos. So if you're working off of a wine book that's old, you may be confused. But in about 1998 or so, they changed the name of it from Leuconostoc enos to Enococcus enos. That's what it is today. And if you look at those two words, both of those words have the word wine in them in Greek, enos. Enococcus genus, enos, enai species. So it's a wine-specific bacteria that, interestingly enough, has no known habitat on our planet. Now, here's a little factoid you can chew on too. The yeast that we know and love, that provides most of our bread, much of our beer, and most of our wine, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, also has no known habitat on our planet. I better move on, or they might censor that part. So what do? During the process, during this whole 3 or 4 month process, I keep the wine topped up. The barrel dehydrates and gives off gases, and at the same time micro-ox goes in. That's what makes wine made in a barrel throughout the whole barreling process taste better, is that exchange of gases, the micro-ox. The dehydration causes me to add 1 bottle of wine per week to this 62-gallon Burgundy barrel. And so that dehydrates the wine. So the wine gets more and more concentrated. Over a 12 or 18 month period, this barrel will consume 5 gallons of wine. So it gets darker and more intense. That's another benefit of working in a barrel. Now, I also maintain the cellar yeast. One can look into the bung and see sometimes some white scummy stuff floating around in there. Let me talk about that. Okay. See if the camera peels on the battery. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read out of the book here. Oh, this is my book, Creating World-Class Red Wine. One paragraph. Not necessarily arresting film yeasts. Not necessarily the scariest, but certainly the most common irritating spoilage organism plaguing wines during the entire cellaring process is the infamous film yeast or cellar yeast. Winemakers use the common terms because cellar yeast can actually be one or more of 3 different species of 2 genus, Candida being the most common. It appears as a white, greasy, chunky film clinging to the surface of the wine. If left to have its way in the wine, it can affect the flavor to the point of ruin. Once it is in a barrel or a carboy, it's usually going to be there for the duration of the cellaring process in greater or lesser amounts. The good news is it is relatively easy to control. Diligence is imperative. Cellar yeasts are aerobic. So the importance of keeping the container topped up is paramount. So you keep it topped up. And when you see the stuff, you take your trusty spray bottle. It's got maybe a tablespoon or 5 to 10 grams per liter of potassium metabisulfite or sodium metabisulfite in it, and you adjust the cone, the spray to a cone, and you nuke it with this. Clean this off. You can put a new clean airlock on if you want, and just keep doing that and control it. Keep it topped up. At the end, at the beginning of this process, I take a pH reading, and that's one of the indicators of when it's done. How do you know when it's done? Well, I'm taking the temperature too all the time. Make sure it's up to temperature, and these little chef thermometers they're it. Well, so I take a pH reading because during the malolactic fermentation process, the pH will go up about 0.12. In other words, if it's at 3.68 right now, or that's where it started. At the end of the process, it'll be at about 3.8, 3.81. So that is it. When it stops going up, that's an indicator that it's done. Another indicator is listening to it. You can hear the snap, crackle, and pop. Another indicator is you can watch the airlock. You can sit down and watch the airlocks for a half an hour, and if it doesn't go off, it's another indicator that it's done. You can do the acid test kit with a litmus test, which is an indicator that you've got some conversion of acids. You can send it out to the lab. But all of those are an indicator that it's probably done. I know all you technical people, you want to have it all absolutely ordered, like you think everything is not infinite. It's all infinite. There are no, you never know for sure. Well, so it's all indicators. So I will use all these indicators to determine when it's over. I'll wait a couple more weeks, and then I'll rack vigorously out of the barrel into another barrel. Top that off. And at the same time, vigorously. Now that's because, remember, I didn't tell you, Enococcus eni is a facultative anaerobe. It's not anaerobic, it doesn't dislike oxygen, and it's not aerobic, it doesn't need oxygen. It's in the middle of that. It's got in between that, facultative anaerobe. But still, it produces kind of stinky sulfur compounds. Barrel tasting, when it's going through ml, is not a pleasant experience. It's kind of stinky. So when you rack it off, you rack it off vigorously and let it gas off. And then I rack onto a fairly substantial amount of SO2 at that point. That's my theory. It's not my theory. I've really actually taken that from Clark Smith's Postmodern Winemaking. If you haven't read that, that's pretty good one to read. I'm not a Clark Smith devotee, and yet I like a couple things that his attitude about the phenolics associated with picking times. I think he really nailed it there. And he feels that after ml, you put a fairly heavy amount of SO2 in it, and then don't put it in again. What the wineries do is they will determine how much SO2 the wine needs based on the pH, and then they will maintain that level throughout the barreling process. Clark feels that the wine is better, that it deals with the SO2 better if you put a stronger amount in now, and then don't do it again until you bottle. On that note, when you bottle, at a winery they bring it up to the level they're supposed to. A lot of wine is filtered, sterile filtered by the way, but not really high quality wines. Home winemakers, when you bottle, you have the option to choose not to add any SO2 at all. During the barreling process, if I start out, during the barreling process, the SO2 gradually decreases naturally. If I put 60 ppm in this, and that's what I'm going to put in it, if I put 60 ppm in here, 12 months later, there's probably only 15 ppm of free SO2. It depends on the wine. They really vary. There's no absolutes. The wine consumes the free SO2. And free SO2 is what we measure. So, but like I said, you home winemakers have the option to not put it in at all. I have friends that do that, and because they don't want to have a lot of SO2 in their wine, and it works out okay. So Americans did not always do malolactic fermentation. Here's the history. Prohibition was from 1919 to 1933. Prior to Prohibition, a lot of wine was made in California, but we don't know who made it. There are records of how much local wines were being consumed and purchased in San Francisco prior to that time, to the tune of thousands of cases per year, but we don't know who was making that wine. Those wineries disappeared. When 1919 occurred, when the Volstead Act, they passed the Volstead Act prohibiting the sale of alcoholic beverages, then the biggest travesty was to the vineyards itself, because a winery is dependent on a vineyard, which is an investment. And so no one knows. One can only wonder what would happen to the American wine industry if it had evolved organically from traditional vineyards, but that's not what occurred. What did happen was Prohibition went until 1933. After 1933, wineries were built not by traditional winemakers, but by investors. They built wineries from the ground up in the new model, which was concrete floors, concrete tanks, pumps, filters, heating systems, and they proceeded to make millions of gallons of cheap, sweet, fortified wines. Well, this was at the bottom of the American Great Depression. People wanted something cheap, sweet, and alcoholic. Now, University of California at Davis at that time began winemaking college, and they were always promoting the creation of better wine. But the tide was against them. The tide was, towards all that cheap wine. That's what Americans were drinking. So UC Davis provided the technology for the making of the wine to those big wineries. UC Davis was traditionally funded by the jug wine industry. So the wine was not made using traditional methods, and that's my point. It was made with chemistry, proper science, which that was American wine until 1967, when the sales of real wine eclipsed the sales of fortified wines in the U.S. Americans' tastes were changing. So what happened? The 70s happened. Winemakers traveled. They traveled to Europe, and they brought back the more traditional techniques back to California. And one of those techniques was malolactic fermentation. Well, the professors at UC Davis were totally negative about malolactic fermentation. This was their attitude. Why would you want to do that? Are you nuts? You mean you're going to do a primary fermentation, and then you're going to put the wine into a used wooden barrel, the sterility of which is dubious at best, and then you're going to leave it in that barrel for 3 or 4 months at room temperature with a bunch of sludge on the bottom without any protection from sulfur or any chemicals? What? No. This is what you should do, according to the professors in 1970 and 1980. You should do a primary fermentation, and then after that, clarify the wine, centrifuge it, sterile filter it down to 0.045 micron, nuke it with potassium sorbate or something, and make a nice, safe wine. A nice, safe jug wine. Right? Well, well, how did that song go? I don't care what Mama don't allow. I'm going to do it anyhow. So the Californians did it anyhow. The wine drinkers liked it. We want that, not that. The tide was going against the chemists, the professors. So, several things happened. One thing was that Lallemand Company came up with a direct inoculate product. Before that time, there was no product. ML occurred naturally. That was another thing. That was another thing that pushed the professor's buttons, is you were just supposed to allow it to occur. Well, finally, Lallemand came up with a three-step culture process and a bacteria that you could purchase to inoculate with malolactic fermentation bacteria. And then also in the 80s, the chemists studied it. And when they finally wrapped their mind around it, when they finally could understand it, then they finally started to promote it. The last little miniature slap I'm going to give to UC Davis at the time was that the University of Bordeaux had already done extensive studies on malolactic fermentation, and it was completely ignored in California. Which, today, wine technology is international. There are no borders anymore. So then they started promoting malolactic fermentation, and finally we ended up with direct inoculation products that we have today, like NBR31, and the other most of the products that you can use are direct inoculation, even though we rehydrate them. So that's the history of it. And so that's where we're at today with malolactic fermentation.